That's what the Bible says in the book of Exodus chapter 21. But when you think of, what do you think of or feel when you hear that phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? I certainly think of some kind of cruel retaliation or vengeance, and I suppose that most people think that way also. But that's not originally what an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth meant. Way before the Old Testament was even written, it was part of the law of the ancient Babylonians. And well after the Old Testament was written, it became part of the legal system of the Roman Empire. When we hear it, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it sounds somewhat barbaric, but originally it was meant to limit a person's desire for revenge. In Jesus' day, damages were settled, as they are largely today, by the payment of an agreed sum of money. Only in a minority of cases were damages settled by applying the law of an eye for an eye. And that meant that you could only retaliate in proportion to the wrong done to you. Nothing more, nothing less. So it was a law about what I would call controlled retaliation or controlled revenge. But Jesus called on his followers to go further. He called on them to do something even more radical. In place of controlled retaliation, Jesus says, offer the wicked no resistance. And then he gives examples as to how aggression can be met by non-violence. To the person striking you on the right cheek, offer the left. To the person who sues you for your undergarment, give your outer garment as well. Show unquestioning generosity towards anyone who wishes to borrow, even if there is no hope of ever getting your money back. Now you can imagine how Jesus' first followers heard that. It really wasn't easy for them to hear such an approach, particularly having grown up with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And when we hear those words of Jesus this morning, as they are addressed to us in Matthew's Gospel, they're not easy words either. What if someone does you a serious wrong? Or even worse again, what if someone did wrong to a person you love, particularly a younger person or a vulnerable person? I imagine that few of us will be quite ready to quote Jesus about turning the other cheek if we were asked to do so. We might be tempted to think in a situation like that this gospel message of his is a gospel for wimps. But the path of non-violence is a tough path. It's a difficult path. It requires amazing strength of character and largeness of heart. And in following his way, Jesus invites us to look beyond our tribal boundaries, beyond our cultural borders and our political loyalties and our religious identities. And then Jesus goes even further again when he says to his first followers, and he says to us, love your enemy. Now at the time of Jesus, Galilee was mainly Jewish territory, but some Gentiles lived there in some of the larger towns, and everything about them was different. They looked different, they dressed differently, the language they spoke was different, the food they ate was different. They were easily marked out as outsiders. And yet Jesus challenged his disciples to have a kind of love that was not limited by those kind of barriers. And he challenges us, his followers, to do the same in a world of economic migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. What Jesus was telling his first disciples, and what he's telling us now, is that this is God's will for us. I'd like to end by telling you a story that I think captures something of Jesus' vision and of God's will for us. So we go back to the 1950s, to a little town in one of the southern states of the United States of America, during the scourge of the Ku Klux Klan. And if you don't know anything about the Ku Klux Klan, they were a white supremacist and racist group, an organization that terrorized, particularly black, Catholic and Jewish people. And very often they lynched their victims. Well, the story is about John, an old black man, who had been a kind of an uncle to generations of children who lived in the town. He taught them to fish and to hunt, and generally he was loved by the children. Now, he owned a small cabin and some land. His wife was dead. He lived there with his little grandson. Then one year, a valuable deposit of copper was discovered near the town, and it ran through John's land. So business people came and offered to buy his land because they wanted to start a mining business. But John wouldn't sell. Then eventually things turned nasty. There were threats. Former friends became enemies. Because he was black, the Ku Klux Klan got involved, and they arrived one evening at his farm and told him, "If you are not off your property tomorrow by sundown, we will hang you." Well, a local preacher got wind of the word, and he went to John's house. Next evening, when the Klansmen came back, hiding behind their white hoods and gowns, the preacher stepped out onto the porch with John and said, "John knows he's going to die this evening, but he asked me to come and to write out his last will and testimony, and he wants me to read it to you. He wants to give his fishing rod to Pete, because he remembers the first bass Pete caught with it. He wants to give his rifle to James, because he remembers using it to teach him to shoot." And so then, item by item, John proceeded to give in love to the very people who had come to take his life. It was more than their hardened spirits could handle. So one by one, the would-be executioners turned away in silence until no one was left. John's little grandson had been watching the whole drama from a distance. After the crowd had dispersed, he ran up onto the porch and said to his grandfather, "What kind of will was that?" The old grandfather answered gently, "The will of God, son, the will of God." I'd like to leave you with a quotation from Coretta Scott King. She was the wife of assassinated Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated in 1968. After his assassination, when asked to comment on an eye for an eye, she said this: "The old law of an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind." It's worth thinking about.